The morning Marcella Hadley rode through Wallace Bailey's fence line, she did not slow down, did not look back, and did not say a single word of apology. And from that moment forward, Wallace Bailey was entirely and irrevocably lost. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle had just exhaled the last of its winter cold. The way a sleeping man finally lets go of a bad dream. The grass along the Red River basin was coming up green and fragile, pushing through the cracked clay earth with the stubborn insistence of things that had no choice but to grow. Wallace had been out since before sunrise, checking the east line of his property, a modest 300-acre cattle operation he had built from a single inheritance of $200 and 4 years of bone-grinding labor. He was 28 years old, broad in the shoulder, quiet in the way that men become quiet when they have spent too long talking only to cattle and open sky. He had dark hair that needed cutting, hands that bore the evidence of every fence post he had ever driven, and eyes the color of dry creek mud, which is to say, a very particular shade of warm brown that most people failed to notice because they were too busy looking at something else. He had just finished checking the tension on a stretch of wire at the eastern corner of his property, the section closest to the ridge where the Callaway spread met his own, when he heard it. The sound came before the sight, a thunder of hooves, not the slow and purposeful rhythm of a working horse, but the full-out, ears back, wind-eating gallop of something being ridden very fast and very intentionally. He straightened up from where he had been crouching and shielded his eyes against the early morning light that was just beginning to stretch itself gold across the flats. She came over the ridge like a piece of weather. The horse was a steel-gray mare, big and deep-chested, with a stride that ate ground in great hungry bites. The woman on her back sat the saddle the way very few people sit a saddle, not like a passenger, but like an extension of the animal itself, her body moving with the mare in a single fluid conversation. She wore a deep brown riding coat, practical and worn at the elbows, and her dark hair had come mostly loose from whatever arrangement it had started the morning in and was streaming behind her in a banner of total disregard for propriety. She was not looking at the fence line. She was looking at the horizon, or at something beyond it, or at nothing at all, and she hit Wallace's wire fence at full speed. The wood post cracked and the wire sang as it gave, and the gray mare cleared it with inches to spare, and the woman did not flinch. She did not rein in. She did not glance back to assess the damage. She rode straight past Wallace at a distance of perhaps 20 feet, and for one suspended second their eyes met. Hers were dark and direct and entirely unapologetic. And then she was past him, and the sound of her hooves was already fading south toward the river. Wallace stood in the broken grass beside his demolished fence post for a long time. Then he pulled his hat off, ran a hand through his hair, set his hat back on, and looked at the ruined fence. He did not fix it that day. He told himself it was because he had other things to do, which was partly true. He told himself it was because he needed to get a new post from the barn first, which was also partly true. But the honest part of himself, the part that had nothing to gain from dishonesty, knew that what he actually did not want to do was erase the physical evidence that she had been there. He asked about her at Greer's General Store in the town of Caldwell Creek 3 days later, describing the gray mare and the brown coat and the dark hair, and old Emmett Greer, who knew everyone within 40 miles in every direction because that was the essential function of a man who ran the only general store for 40 miles in every direction, leaned on his counter and said, "That'll be Marcella Hadley. Her daddy just died and left her the Hadley place up on the north end of the basin. She's been up there 6 weeks now, and she has not, as far as I can tell, asked a single living soul for a single piece of help with anything." Wallace bought his flour and his coffee and his salt, and he rode home thinking about a woman who did not apologize and did not ask for help, and he thought about her all evening while he cooked his supper on the iron stove, And he thought about her while he sat on the porch in the blue evening dark, watching the coyotes begin to call to each other across the flats, and he went to sleep thinking about her still. The Hadley place was 7 miles north of Wallace's property, up where the basin flattened out and the grass grew sparser, and the wind came down from the north without anything to stop it. He had heard of old Thomas Hadley. Most people in the territory had heard of Thomas Hadley at one time or another, because Thomas Hadley had been the kind of man who generated stories the way certain storms generate lightning, frequently and with very little warning. He had come to the Panhandle in the early days, before most people thought it was survivable, and he had stayed when most others left, and over 30 years he had built something from nothing, and then, according to rumor, had mostly drunk it back down to almost nothing again in the last decade. What he had left behind was a daughter who could ride like the wind and apparently felt no obligation to the fences of other people's properties. Wallace did not go to see her right away. He was not, as previously established, a man who moved quickly in most things. He had the patience of someone who has learned the hard way that impatience costs more than it saves. He watched from a careful distance in the way a man watches weather forming on the horizon, respectfully, with full attention, and without pretending he could control what was coming. He saw her again 2 weeks after the fence incident, at the town water trough, where she was filling canteens with the brisk efficiency of someone who had a great many things left to accomplish before sundown. She was alone, which appeared to be her natural state. She wore the same brown coat and a pair of work trousers that had clearly been made for someone taller, and her dark hair was braided this time, a practical single braid that hung between her shoulder blades. She looked to be about 25, maybe 26, with a face that was not soft and not hard, but rather precise. The kind of face that told you exactly what it was thinking and expected you to keep up. Wallace tied his horse at the rail and nodded to her. "Morning," she glanced at him with those dark, direct eyes. "Morning." He thought about saying something clever. He thought about saying something about the fence. He thought about saying anything at all. What he said was, "Nice mare." She looked at the gray horse, then back at him, and something shifted at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but was in the family of one. "She knows it," Marcella Hadley said. And she capped her canteen, tucked it under her arm, and walked back to her horse with the rolling, unhurried stride of a person who has never in their life been in a hurry to please anyone. Wallace watched her go. He was aware that he was watching her go in a way that was entirely visible to everyone on the street, and he did not particularly care. Emmett Greer materialized at his elbow with the supernatural timing that shopkeepers develop after decades of commerce. "She doesn't talk much," Emmett said, by way of either helpful information or gentle warning. "I noticed," Wallace said. "Her daddy left the place in rough shape. Fencing down. Barn needs work. She's been up there alone doing it all herself, far as I can tell. Won't hire on any help." Emmett paused. "She came in here last week and bought 300 fence staples, 20 pounds of flour, and a bottle of liniment. Nothing else." Wallace thought about the fencing she had been doing alone. He thought about the fence post he still had not replaced on his eastern line, the one she had knocked down in the first morning light of an April day. He thought about how the gap in his fence line, after a month, still felt less like a hole than like a door left open. The next morning, he loaded his wagon with fence posts. Not just a couple, a full load, 15 posts and a spool of wire and a proper post driver, the kind that required 2 hands and built up a genuine heat in the shoulders. He drove north. The Hadley place announced itself before he saw it, a smell of old timber and new sawdust and horse, and then the sound of hammering, steady and rhythmic and relentless, and then the sight of a woman in the middle distance driving stakes into the ground with the single-minded focus of someone who has been alone long enough that they no longer waste motion. He stopped the wagon at a reasonable distance and called out, "Hello, the property." She stopped hammering and looked up. He could not read her expression at that distance. After a moment she said, "You're the man with the fence." He climbed down from the wagon. "Wallace Bailey. My place is south of here, 7 miles south. I have a fence line on the east side that I know what I rode through," she said. She had put the post driver down but had not moved toward him. There was about 30 feet of open ground between them, and she seemed comfortable keeping it that way. "If you want payment for the post, I can." "I don't want payment," he said quickly. Then, because that had come out with perhaps more force than was socially advisable, he added more carefully, "I brought posts. I thought you might be running short is all. I have a load, more than I need for my place right now." A silence, the kind of silence that had weather in it. "Why?" she said. It was, he reflected, an extremely direct question. He liked it very much. He thought about several answers and discarded all of them except the one that was actually true. "Because you looked like someone who had more work than they had help for," he said, "and I had posts." Marcella Hadley looked at him for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes. Then she looked at the wagon, then back at him. "I don't need charity," she said. "It's not charity. I'll work them off against anything you see fit." He paused. "I'm also a fair hand at fencing if you're short on labor today." Another silence. This one was slightly different in texture, less wary and more calculating. "Do you know how to set a corner post properly?" she said. "I do. Most men say they do and do it halfway," she said. "Most men do most things halfway," he agreed. And there it was, not quite a smile, but definitely closer than the water trough had produced. She turned and picked up her post driver. "Come on, then," she said over her shoulder. "I've got 400 feet of east line that looks like it lost a fight." That day was one of the finest days of Wallace Bailey's adult life, and nothing dramatic happened in it. They worked the fence line together from mid-morning until the light got long and golden in the late afternoon. She worked hard and clean and without complaint, and she did not talk much. But when she did talk, it was worth listening to. She knew exactly how she wanted things done, and she said so plainly without apology or embellishment. And he found this quality, which some men might have called difficult, to be one of the most refreshing things he had encountered in recent memory. He had spent a great deal of time around men who said a great deal and meant very little of it. And the inverse was something he had not known he was hungry for until he was standing in the middle of it. Around mid-afternoon, she brought water from the well in a tin bucket and 2 cups, and they stood in the shade of a scrubby cottonwood that had no business being alive this far north on the flats, and drank in silence. He watched a red-tailed hawk work the thermals above the ridge. She watched the same hawk. "You've been out here on your own since April," he said. "Since March," she said. "I was here before he died, taking care of him at the end. I'm sorry for your loss." She looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy her that he meant it genuinely and wasn't just performing the expected ritual. "He was a hard man," she said. "But he was the only father I had, and it was his land before it was mine, and I intend to make something of it." "Where were you before you came back here?" "Kansas. I was teaching school in Dodge City for 3 years. She said it as a fact, without the self-deprecating hedge that women often added when they mentioned things that might be considered unusual. She had been a school teacher. She had come back to work a cattle ranch alone. Both of these things were simply true. "You gave that up to come back here," he said. "I gave it up to keep this land," she said. "My father would have sold it for drinking money inside of a year if he'd lived. He'd already sold off 200 acres on the west side. The buyers were circling the rest of it." She paused. "I am not going to let that happen." He believed her entirely. He would have bet a significant portion of his cattle operation on the certainty that Marcella Hadley was going to do exactly what she said she was going to do. They finished a substantial length of fence by the time the sky turned orange and pink behind the western ridge, and she walked him back to his wagon and thanked him, simply and without ceremony, in the way people thank each other when they mean it rather than when they are performing gratitude. "I'll come back Thursday if you like," he said. "I can bring the rest of the posts." She considered this. "Thursday is fine," she said. He drove south in the fading light, feeling something he had not felt in a very long time, something warm and alive and slightly frightening that sat in his chest like an ember that had been waiting a considerable while to become a fire. He came back on Thursday, and then the following Tuesday because she had mentioned needing help with the barn roof, and he happened to have cedar shingles. And then on a Saturday because he had been driving past the North Road anyway, which was not entirely true, but was not entirely a lie either, since the North Road did technically lead back to his place by a longer route. By June, he was finding reasons to be on the North Road at least twice a week, and Marcella Hadley was no longer watching him across 30 feet of open ground when he arrived. She would come out from whatever she was working on and say hello, and they would work together through the long summer hours. And by evening, they would sit on the steps of the low porch that ran across the front of the old Hadley house and talk. She was extraordinarily good company. This was the part that kept surprising him, though he was not sure why it should have. He had observed from the start that she was sharp and direct and had no patience for nonsense. But there was also a dry wit that lived beneath the practicality, and a genuine hunger for conversation about things that mattered. She had opinions on cattle breeding, land rights, the railroad's steady encroachment on open range, the Indian Territory situation, the treatment of the Comanche who had been pushed off land that had been theirs for generations. She spoke about this last subject with a particular thoughtfulness that he respected, the kind that acknowledged complicated truth rather than reaching for comfortable simplicity. "My father was not a good man in that regard," she said one evening in late June, when they were talking about the dispossession of the tribes that had once ranged freely across the same land they were now sitting on. The sun was going down in watercolor layers behind the ridge. He never thought about it. He thought the land was just there to be taken, and what had been done to get it clear for the taking was just business. "Most people thought that way," Wallace said carefully. "Most people were wrong," she said. "The Comanche were pushed onto the reservation at Fort Sill in Reno 3 years ago, and the land they lived on for hundreds of years was handed to cattle operations like mine and like yours. I know what I'm standing on. I think it's important to know that." He looked at her in the orange light. "You are not like anyone I have ever met," he said. She turned to look at him, and there was a brief, charged moment, the kind of moment that changes the temperature of the air around it, and then she looked back at the horizon. "Is that good or bad?" she said, with a very careful lightness in her voice. "It is entirely and completely good," he said. The silence that followed was the most comfortable silence he had ever sat inside. In early July, trouble arrived from the west in the form of a man named Denton Carr. Denton Carr was 35, floridly mustachioed, and owned the largest cattle operation in the county, the Lazy D, which had grown to its current size primarily through the strategy of purchasing land from people who were in distress and did not have good options. He was not, technically speaking, a dishonest man. He paid what the law required, honored contracts to the letter, and was broadly considered a pillar of the Caldwell Creek community, which gave him a social respectability that Wallace had always found slightly nauseating, the way something can look very clean on the outside and smell wrong anyway. Carr rode onto the Hadley property on a Tuesday morning in a pressed shirt and good boots, which meant he had been planning to make an impression. Wallace happened to be there helping Marcella clear out the old hay from the barn loft, a miserable, itchy job that needed doing before she could store the summer cut, and he watched from the upper loft door as Carr dismounted in the yard below with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to arriving places and being paid attention to. "Miss Hadley," Carr said in a rich baritone that carried beautifully, "you are looking well." "Mr. Carr," Marcella said, without warmth. She had a pitchfork in her hands and did not put it down. "What can I do for you?" Wallace leaned against the loft door and listened. Carr's pitch was smooth and well rehearsed. The Hadley place was a fine property, but a difficult one for a single woman to manage alone. Land values were good right now, and likely to decline when the railroad came through and opened up the northern ranges. He was prepared to offer a fair price with a 30-day close, and she would walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere considerably more comfortable than the Texas Panhandle in summer. Marcella listened to all of it. She had the gift of complete stillness when she was listening, no fidgeting, no reactive expressions, just full and total attention that somehow communicated less warmth than a stone wall. When Carr finished, she said, "The Hadley land is not for sale." Carr smiled the smile of a man who has heard this before and considers it an opening position rather than a final answer. "Miss Hadley, I understand the emotional attachment. The land is not for sale," she said again. Same tone. No adjustment. "If you have no other business here, I have a barn loft to finish." There was a beat of silence in which Carr's smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He looked up at the loft door, apparently noticing Wallace for the first time, and something shifted in his calculation. He settled his hat and said, pleasantly enough, "I'll leave my offer in writing at Greer's. You can let me know when you change your mind." "I won't," she said. He rode out. Wallace climbed down from the loft. Marcella was still standing in the yard with the pitchfork, watching the cloud of dust Carr's departure raised on the west road. "He'll come back," Wallace said. "I know," she said. "Has he been before today?" "Twice. This was the third time." She turned back to the barn. "He thinks persistence will wear me down. It won't." "I know," Wallace said. And because he could not stop himself. "Do you want me to be here when he comes again?" She looked at him over her shoulder, and this time the thing at the corner of her mouth was unambiguously a smile, small and real and private. "I can handle Denton Carr," she said. "I have absolutely no doubt about that," Wallace said. "I asked if you wanted company." She held his gaze for a moment, and then the smile widened slightly. "I might not mind company," she said, and went back into the barn. It was, as declarations went, about as much as he was going to get from Marcella Hadley at that point in time, and he understood that, and he was content with it, because he had learned already that she was someone worth being patient for. The summer deepened into August heat, the kind that makes the air above the flats shimmer, and the cattle stand with their heads down in whatever shade they can find. Wallace had his own operation to run, 45 head that needed watching, a hay crop that needed cutting and stacking before the afternoon thunderstorms that rolled in most evenings could flatten it, a water situation that required constant attention, because the creek ran low in August, and the cattle needed to be moved between 3 different tank locations to keep the grazing balanced. He was not a rich man, but he was a careful one, and careful men in the Panhandle in 1878 generally survived where reckless ones did not. But he found time to be on the North Road. He found time the way a man who is motivated finds time, by getting up earlier and going to bed later and doing 2 jobs in the space of one. He was not doing it out of obligation. He was doing it because the hours he spent at the Hadley place had become the parts of his days that he thought about the most and looked forward to the most, and because Marcella Hadley had become, without any formal announcement or ceremony, the most important person in his world. He had not said this to her. He was not entirely sure how to say it, or when, or whether she would receive it the way he meant it, or whether it would complicate the easy and good thing they had built between them over these months of shared labor and evening conversation. He was a man who thought carefully before speaking, which was one of his better qualities and occasionally a significant inconvenience. The declaration, when it came, did not come from him first. It was a Wednesday evening in late August, after a day of exceptional heat that had slowly given way to a tremendous lightning storm rolling in from the north. They had spent the afternoon moving her cattle. She had 8 head now, bought in June with the last of the cash her father had left, and she was feeding them through the summer with every intention of selling calves in the spring, to the south pasture where there was better shelter from the coming weather. The thunder was already audible by the time they got the last of the cattle settled, and the lightning was doing spectacular things along the northern horizon, blue-white and immediate, the way electrical storms are in flat country where there is nothing between you and the sky. They had come up onto the porch to watch it come in, standing at the rail with the wind picking up around them, and smelling of rain and ozone and something clean and wild. It was one of those moments that the Panhandle occasionally produced without warning, moments of such absolute physical beauty that they pressed on the chest. Marcella was standing close beside him, closer than was strictly required by the width of the porch, and he was aware of that proximity the way you are aware of a source of warmth in a cool room. The first rain came in a sudden sheet across the flat, hissing through the grass and bringing the smell of wet earth with it. "Wallace," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the lightning split the dark sky. "I am not particularly good at this," she said, "at saying things." "You are exceptional at saying things," he said, because he genuinely believed this. "Not these kinds of things," she said. She still had not looked at him, and he had not looked at her. They were both watching the storm. "I want to tell you that I'm glad you came with those fence posts in April." She paused. "I'm glad you kept coming back." "So am I," he said. "I'm not looking to be taken care of," she said. "I want to be very clear about that. I have taken care of myself for a long time, and I am fully capable of continuing to do so." "I know," he said. "Good." A pause. That being said, another pause, and the rain was hitting the porch roof now in a full drumming roar. "I think I would be very disappointed if you stopped coming around." He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him at almost the same moment, which meant they were suddenly much closer than either of them had calculated, and the rain was loud around them, and the lightning lit her face in bright intermittent flashes, and she was looking at him with those direct dark eyes that never hid anything. "I would be very disappointed too," he said. "All right," she said, as if something had been settled. As if they had, between them, reached a mutual and satisfying conclusion by way of an extremely roundabout route. She looked back at the storm. He looked at the storm too. After a moment he said, "Marcella." "Yes." "May I?" He stopped, started again. "When you are ready. At whatever pace you—" He stopped again, frustrated with himself in a way that was rare and therefore additionally frustrating. She looked at him again with that small private smile. "You may court me, Wallace Bailey," she said. "If that is what you are trying to ask." "It is," he said. "Good," she said. And she was quiet after that, but it was the richest and most complete quiet he had ever sat inside, the kind that had a whole future in it. September arrived with cooling temperatures and the particular quality of light that the Panhandle got in autumn, slanted and golden, and making everything look as though it had been carefully considered. Wallace's courtship of Marcella Hadley was, by the standards of most courtships, unusual in its structure, because the structure was essentially the same as what it had always been: working together, talking, sitting on the porch in the evenings, but with an additional quality of open acknowledgement that changed everything. Now when he looked at her, he did not have to look quickly away. Now when she said something that amused him, he could let the warmth in his expression be visible. Now there was a whole vocabulary of small things. The way she would say his name at the beginning of a sentence when she was about to tell him something she thought he would find interesting. The way he would bring her coffee in the mornings when he arrived without being asked, because he had noticed that she always needed it. The way they had developed the habit of working in a companionable proximity that said something loudly without saying anything at all. He brought her wildflowers once, in early September. Just a handful of what was still blooming on the flats, some yellow and some purple, nothing impressive. He left them on the porch step when he arrived, and she was not yet out from the house. She came out, saw them, picked them up, and smelled them. She said nothing to him about them, but he noticed that evening when he went to get his hat from just inside the front door that she had put them in a tin cup of water on the windowsill. He did not mention this, and neither did she. It was better that way. Denton Carr came back in October, and this time he brought a lawyer. The lawyer was a narrow man from Amarillo named Percival Ames, who wore a black coat that was entirely wrong for the Panhandle in October, and carried a leather satchel that he gripped as though it contained his own personal virtue. Carr and Ames arrived on a Monday morning when the temperature had dropped overnight, and the first real cold edge of fall was in the air. Wallace was there. He had come in the early morning with supplies for the winter. He had been making quiet note over the months of what Marcella needed, and had developed a habit of bringing things without comment, and she had developed a habit of accepting them without comment, and this was one of the ways they talked to each other without talking. He was splitting wood in the side yard when the two riders came up the north road. Marcella came out of the house and stood on the porch, and Wallace put down his axe and moved to stand at the edge of the porch, not in front of her. She would not have wanted that, but beside her, slightly to her right, in a way that said something about presence and solidarity without saying anything about the ability of this woman to handle her own affairs. Carr dismounted and made his customary introductions. Ames opened his satchel and produced papers. What the papers said, in the careful language of law, was that Thomas Hadley, at some point in the last year of his life, had signed over a parcel of the northeast quarter of the Hadley land to Denton Carr's company in exchange for a debt payment. The signature was genuine. Ames was at pains to establish this, clearly anticipating that it would be challenged. The question was whether the signature had been obtained under circumstances that were entirely legitimate, because Thomas Hadley in the last years of his life had not been entirely in command of his faculties, and everyone in Caldwell Creek who had known him understood this, even if the law did not have a particularly elegant mechanism for dealing with it. Marcella took the papers. She read them carefully and completely, standing on her porch in the October cold, and her face gave nothing away. When she finished, she handed them back to Ames. "When was this signed?" she said. "November of last year," Ames said. "My father was very ill in November of last year. He was not able to manage his own correspondence, let alone business contracts." She kept her voice level and even, the way she kept everything level and even. "The signature is genuine, Miss Hadley," Carr said, not unkindly. He was doing the performance of regret. "I understand this is difficult. You went to a dying man and had him sign over his land," Marcella said. The level quality had not changed. But there was something underneath it that Wallace recognized as contained fury, the kind that runs hotter than visible anger precisely because it is being held in check. "While I was in Kansas, while I didn't know," a pause. "That is what happened." "The document is entirely legal," Ames said. "I intend to determine that for myself," Marcella said. "You will give me 2 weeks to have these papers reviewed by my own attorney." Carr and Ames exchanged a glance. Carr settled his hat. 2 weeks, he said, with the generosity of someone who is very confident of the outcome. They rode away, and Marcella stood on the porch looking at the space they had occupied until the sound of their horses faded. Then she turned and walked inside, and Wallace followed, and she sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands, and it was the only time he had ever seen her do anything that looked like giving way. He sat across from her and said nothing for a moment. Then, "There is a lawyer in Amarillo by the name of Josiah Reeves who is a fair and honest man and who has dealt with precisely this kind of situation before. I know him personally. I can have him here within the week." She lifted her face from her hands. Her eyes were bright but dry. "Can he do anything?" "I don't know," Wallace said honestly. "But he is the best chance you have." She nodded. "Once." "Write to him," she said. He wrote to Josiah Reeves that afternoon, and Reeves arrived by the following Friday. A stocky, gray-haired man with reading spectacles and the brisk manner of someone who took the law seriously as a thing meant to protect people rather than as a tool for whoever could afford the sharpest version of it. He reviewed the documents at the Hadley kitchen table and asked careful questions and was quiet for a long time. "The signature is genuine," he said finally. Marcella nodded. She already knew this. "However," Reeves said, and the word hung in the kitchen air like a promise, "the circumstances of this agreement are what is called undue influence in law. Your father was documented as ill by the county physician in November of last year. There is a record of his condition. Carr knew this man's state, came to him while he was compromised, and obtained a signature on a property transfer. That is not a clean transaction." He paused. I cannot guarantee we can overturn it. But I believe I can make Carr understand that pursuing this claim will cost him considerably more in legal complication and public reputation than the value of the Northeast Quarter. Marcella's hands were flat on the table. "Do it," she said. What followed over the next 3 weeks was a kind of quiet legal battle conducted entirely in correspondence, and one meeting in the office of Caldwell Creek's county clerk, which Wallace attended alongside Marcella because she asked him to, and because wild horses could not have kept him away. Reeves was measured and precise and utterly implacable, and Carr, who was fundamentally a businessman rather than a man who enjoyed a genuine fight, eventually calculated his costs and settled. He withdrew his claim to the Northeast Quarter in exchange for a formal release of any further legal challenge, and rode out of Marcella Hadley's story with his dignity slightly dented and his pocketbook intact. When Reeves delivered the news on a Thursday morning in early November, Marcella shook the old lawyer's hand with both of hers and said thank you in a voice that had something in it that surprised even her, a brief and uncharacteristic roughness that meant more than she would have chosen to show. Reeves rode back to Amarillo. Marcella and Wallace stood in the yard in the November cold, their breath fogging in the gray air, and he watched the tension he had been watching in her shoulders and jaw for 3 weeks slowly, visibly dissolve. She exhaled a long, slow breath. "All right," she said. "All right. All right," he agreed. She turned to look at him, and something in her expression was entirely new and entirely unguarded in a way he had not seen before. "Thank you," she said. "Not for fixing it, you didn't fix it. Reeves fixed it, but for she stopped. For being here," he offered. "For being here," she agreed. "You have a gift for being present in a way that doesn't require anything. I don't know if you know that about yourself." He looked at her. "I know that being here is the only place I want to be," he said. The unguarded expression deepened. She took a half step toward him, and he was very still, and she reached up and put her palm flat against his jaw for just a moment, warm and certain and brief, and then stepped back. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He followed her inside. His heart was conducting itself in a fairly undignified manner which he kept entirely to himself. Winter came down on the Panhandle in November with the characteristic absence of ambiguity that characterized all Panhandle. Weather cold happened, and then it was cold, and the wind came, and the sky settled into the particular flat gray of a Texas winter sky. Wallace spent more and more evenings at the Hadley place, because the alternative was spending them at his own place, and the quality of his evenings at his own place had declined substantially since he had discovered what evenings could be like when they involved Marcella Hadley. He had a hired hand named Pete Delacroix, a Creole man from Louisiana who had come west 15 years ago and never gone back, partly because the West suited his temperament and partly, Wallace suspected, because Louisiana had certain specific structural injustices that made leaving it the more survivable option. Pete was 32 and excellent with horses, laconic in the manner of someone who had seen a great deal and had made peace with most of it, and he had been working Wallace's spread for 2 years. He kept his own counsel about his employer's romantic situation, but occasionally let slip a dryly observational comment that suggested he found the whole thing quietly entertaining. Heading north again, Pete said one evening in December, watching Wallace saddle his horse. "Just to check on the cattle," Pete said. "Yes, you've been checking on those cattle considerably more than most cattle require." Wallace tightened the girth strap. "Mind your business, Pete." "I am minding my business," Pete said. "My business is making sure those cattle get fed in the morning, which they will be. Your business appears to be considerably north of here." He picked up his coffee cup. "She seems like a good woman, from what I saw when she stopped here last month for that wire." Marcella had stopped at Wallace's place in November to return a spool of wire she had borrowed, a transaction that had taken 45 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than it needed to, and had involved coffee and a very good conversation about the coming winter and cattle prices and a hawk they had both noticed hunting the south pasture, and at the end of which she had said goodbye with the particular quality of reluctance that Wallace had been cataloging with increasing attention. "She is a good woman," Wallace said simply. "Then you might want to do something about that at some point before spring," Pete said with great serenity. Christmas came. Wallace made his most deliberate effort of the whole acquaintance. He had been thinking about it for weeks, not a grand gesture, because Marcella was not a grand gesture person, but something true. He arrived on the morning of Christmas Eve with a wooden leather saddle satchel. He had made himself over the course of 3 evenings by lamplight stitched tight, and fitted exactly to the gray mare's dimensions, which he had measured covertly over several months. He had also brought a hamper with food for the holiday, the practical part of the gesture, which gave the whole thing a cover of useful reason that he thought she would find more comfortable than pure sentiment. She turned the saddle satchel over in her hands when he presented it, running her thumbs along the stitching, examining the buckles. She was quiet for a long time, then she looked up. "You made this," she said. "I did. You measured Pepper's dimensions without me noticing." "I did." She looked at it again. He waited, watching her face. She was struggling with something. He could see it, that characteristic tension between the self-sufficient person she had trained herself to be and whatever else she also was, the part that needed things and wanted things and had spent a long time not allowing itself to. "It's beautiful," she said finally, and her voice had that slight roughness in it again. "Merry Christmas," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she went inside and came back with a small folded piece of paper which she held out to him. He opened it. It was a map of the Hadley property drawn in her precise, neat hand, but the east boundary had been extended and labeled in pencil. "Shared grazing rights, east pasture, perpetual." He looked at the map. He looked at her. "This is sensible," she said firmly. "Your east pasture runs dry in late summer and mine doesn't. This is a practical arrangement." A pause. "It is also the thing I have that is worth giving." "Marcella," he said. "Don't make it into something large," she said. "Just say thank you." "Thank you," he said. "And Marcella, Wallace." "I love you," he said, very simply, the way he said most true things. She took a very specific kind of breath. "I know," she said, and then faster, as if she had to get it out before she could stop herself. "I love you too. I have for a while. I didn't know precisely when it started, but I think it was the fence." "The fence," he said. "When you didn't fix it," she said. "I rode back past it 2 days later and it was still broken, and I thought, that man is leaving a door open." She stopped. "I thought I was imagining things." "You were not," he said. She looked at him with her whole face open, which was the rarest and most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. This woman who kept everything close and careful suddenly keeping nothing close at all, just looking at him with her heart entirely visible in her dark eyes. He stepped forward and she did not step back, and he put his hands on her face, and she tipped her chin up, and he kissed her, very gently and very completely, in the cold December morning air on the porch of the Hadley house. When he lifted his head, she was looking at him with that unguarded expression and a warmth in her face that made her look entirely different and entirely the same and more herself than he had ever seen her. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "About time," she said. He laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she smiled the full, unreserved smile that he had been working toward in his patient way for 9 months, and it was worth every moment of the patient working toward it, and he kissed her again. Winter settled around them. They spent the holiday together, cooking at her stove and talking and sitting in front of the fireplace, and he rode home at night in the dark, and the cold with the kind of warmth in him that has nothing to do with temperature. January brought with it the relentless wind and occasional snow of a Panhandle winter, and also brought with it the practical question of how 2 people who had confessed to loving each other were going to organize their lives when those lives were 7 miles apart, and each contained an independent cattle operation. This question interested Wallace very much. He thought about it with the focused attention he gave to everything important, which was the attention of a man who understands that the most significant problems deserve the most careful thought, rather than the most hasty action. He also thought about it because he was 30 years old in January, and he had been alone for a long time, and he did not want to be alone anymore, which was its own clear and simple statement of intent. He talked to Pete Delacroix about it, which required somewhat less courage than talking to Marcella about it, but was a useful preliminary exercise. If a man has a cattle operation and a woman has a cattle operation, Wallace said one evening, cleaning his rifle by the stove, and the man wanted to propose to the woman, how would that conversation about the land even begin? Pete, who was mending a harness with the patience of a man who has mended a great many harnesses, did not look up. Well, he said, I expect it begins with the man asking the woman to marry him, and the two of them figuring out the rest of it together from there. Wallace looked at him. As opposed to, Pete continued, the man figuring all of the land logistics out first and then presenting the woman with an already solved problem that she had no part in solving. That was not what I was going to do, Wallace said Pete. It wasn't. Wallace put the rifle down. She's going to want to keep the Hadley land in her name. Of course she is, Pete said. It was her father's land and she fought for it. That's fine with me. You should tell her that, Pete said. Rather than me. He rode to the Hadley place on a Saturday in late January, in the middle of the afternoon when the sky was that peculiarly beautiful winter blue and the snow was thin on the ground, more frost than snow. Marcella was in the barn, which was her usual weekend location in winter, managing the hay and the water for her cattle. He went in and leaned against the stall door and watched her work for a moment. I want to ask you something, he said. She glanced at him over her shoulder. All right. I want to ask you to marry me, he said. Before I do that, I want you to know, I know what the Hadley land means to you, and I have no interest in absorbing it into my operation or changing its name or any of the rest of it. Whatever we build together, this land stays yours. Your name stays yours. I'm asking to share my life with you, not to acquire your property. She had stopped working. She was holding a hay fork and looking at him with that measuring directness. That is a very thorough preamble, she said. I have been thinking about it for a while, he said. How long is a while? Since approximately April, he said, which was perhaps premature in retrospect. Perhaps, she agreed, but she was smiling. The real smile, the full one. She put the hay fork down against the wall. Wallace. Yes. Ask me properly, she said. He took a breath. Marcella Hadley, will you marry me? She looked at him for a long, still moment in the winter light of the barn, and the gray mare shifted in her stall beside them, and outside the January wind moved through the grass in its long, low voice. Yes, she said, I will. He crossed the distance between them, and she met him halfway, which was exactly right. And he held her in the quiet barn, and she put her arms around him, and they stood together for a long time in the warmth of the horses and the hay, and the winter blew around them and could not touch them. They were married in March, 1 year almost to the day since she had ridden through his fence. The ceremony was held in Caldwell Creek at the Methodist Church, which was a low white building that smelled of candle wax and old hymn books, and was performed by a minister named Reverend Hartwell, who had the good sense to keep the ceremony brief and the words genuine. Emmett Greer from the general store stood witness along with Pete Delacroix, who had put on his best shirt for the occasion, and looked quietly pleased in the way that people look when they have been watching two people move toward each other for a year, and the watching has finally resolved. Marcella wore a dress she had made herself in the months of their engagement, a deep blue wool that was practical enough to have been worth making, and beautiful enough to have been worth the considerable time she had spent on it. And she wore her dark hair in a complicated knot that Wallace had watched her spend 45 minutes producing on the morning of the wedding, during which time she had told him 3 times to stop looking at her, and he had not stopped looking at her. When she walked down the short aisle toward him, she was looking directly at him, because she was Marcella and she did not look away from things. And he stood at the front of the little church and watched her come toward him and felt something enormous and certain settle into place in his chest, like a key finding a lock it was made for. The minister asked the questions, and they gave the answers, and he slid a plain gold band onto her finger that he had ordered from the jeweler in Amarillo, and that fit exactly as intended, because he had measured her finger in her sleep one morning in February, which she did not yet know about. Later, when she found out, she laughed so hard she had to put her coffee cup down. He kissed her at the minister's instruction, and she pulled back after a socially appropriate interval and whispered, "Stop looking so satisfied with yourself," against his mouth, and he whispered back, "I am satisfied with myself," and she made a small sound that was mostly a laugh. Emmett Greer produced a bottle of good whiskey, and they drank a toast on the church steps in the March sunshine, and Pete shook Wallace's hand and said, "Congratulations," and then turned to Marcella and said, "You are a very patient woman," and Marcella said, "He is absolutely worth the patience," and Wallace decided that was the finest wedding toast he had ever heard. The question of the properties was resolved practically and sensibly, the way Marcella resolved most things. They kept both operations running, which meant more work but also more land and more cattle and more long-term stability. They decided that the Hadley house, larger and in a better position relative to the water, would be the home they shared. Wallace brought his furniture and his books and his iron stove. The stove at the Bailey place was considerably better than the one at the Hadley place, and Marcella acknowledged this without any fuss, and Pete Delacroix moved into the Bailey house as a full property manager, with a formal arrangement that Wallace put in writing because Pete had earned it. The fence on the east line of Wallace's property, the very fence that Marcella had demolished in April of the previous year, was finally repaired that spring, properly this time, with a gate. Wallace put the gate there himself. He told Marcella it was for practical access between the two properties. She looked at the gate and then at him with those dark knowing eyes and said nothing, which meant she understood perfectly. The spring of 1879 arrived with new grass and new cattle, and the particular richness of a life that has found its proper shape. They worked the land together with the same fluid partnership they had always had, but amplified now by the intimacy of people who share a house and a table and a bed, who know each other's rhythms and moods and habits. Wallace had discovered that Marcella was a remarkable cook when she chose to be, which was not every day, and she had discovered that he had an absolute inability to leave a straight edge unchecked, which manifested in things like perfect fence lines and very precisely stacked wood, and they had both found that the habits and qualities they had observed in each other from a distance were even more interesting and alive at close range. They argued sometimes because they were both people with opinions and neither of them suffered from excessive deference. The arguments were clean and direct and resolved, which is the best kind. He would occasionally miscalculate her need for silence, and she would occasionally forget that he needed to say things out loud to understand them, and they would have a conversation about this and adjust and move forward. They had the fundamental compatibility of two people who respect each other genuinely, which turns out to be more durable than most of the other kinds. In June of 1879, Marcella told him she was expecting. She told him at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, directly and without ceremony, the way she did everything, and he sat across from her and looked at her and felt something happen inside him that he did not have language for, a quality of joy that was also a quality of fear and also something beyond both of them that was simply enormous and alive. "You're sure?" he said. "I am sure," she said. She was watching him with that careful attention. "Marcella," he said, and his voice came out differently than he intended, full of everything he was feeling. This is the best news I have ever heard in my life." She exhaled, and he realized she had been holding something back, waiting to see how he would receive it, and the relief in her face was quiet and warm. "Good," she said. "I think I feel the same way." She paused. "I think I feel exactly the same way." He came around the table and kissed the top of her head, and she tipped her head back and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and it was one of those moments that crystallizes perfectly in memory, clear and complete. The pregnancy was not easy. By midsummer, she was dealing with a persistent exhaustion that she resented and argued with, in the way she argued with all her physical limitations, and he had developed an entirely new level of admiration for her stubbornness, because she kept working and kept managing the ranch with a somewhat modified schedule that she had determined herself, tolerating no adjustments she had not personally approved. He quietly took on more of the physical labor without comment, and she quietly accepted this without comment, and this was one of their languages that they had perfected over the months of their life together. He worried about her with a depth and constancy that would have astonished his younger self, who had never worried about anyone but himself and his cattle. He did not express this worry in ways she found suffocating, because he understood what she needed, which was competence and presence and trust. He told her once that he was afraid, and she looked at him with a kindness that he had not expected from someone so fundamentally brisk, and she said, "I know, me too. But I am strong and healthy, and we are going to be fine." And he believed her, not because he needed to believe her, but because it was likely true and she had never once lied to him. Their son was born in February of 1880 in the bedroom of the Hadley house, delivered by Mrs. Clara Webb, the county midwife, who had been delivering babies in this part of the Panhandle for 20 years and had the calm authority of someone who has seen everything twice. It was a February night with a north wind and snow on the ground, and Wallace sat in the kitchen with his hands around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold, listening to the sounds of the house, and Pete Delacroix sat across from him because he had ridden over when word got around, which was the kind of man Pete was. When Mrs. Webb came out and told him he had a son, Wallace stood up so quickly he knocked his chair back. "Mother and baby are both doing very well," Mrs. Webb said, with the particular smile of a woman who has given this news many times and has never grown tired of how people receive it. He went into the bedroom and found Marcella propped against pillows with the particular new and total exhaustion of a woman who has done something enormous and survived it, and a small, red, furiously alive bundle in her arms. She looked up at him, and she was tired beyond description, and she was more beautiful than he had ever seen her in his life. "Come and meet Thomas Wallace Bailey," she said. Her voice was rough and quiet. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who had dark hair and was making a sound of general discontent at the cold new world. And then he looked at his wife, and he thought about the April morning she had ridden through his fence line with her hair streaming out behind her and her eyes direct and entirely unapologetic. And he thought about the fence post he had left broken in the ground all those months, the door he had kept open without knowing why. And he understood with the perfect clarity of hindsight that the universe had occasionally been generous to him in ways he had not deserved. "Thomas Wallace," he said. "He has your eyebrows," Marcella said. "Those are very good eyebrows." "They are adequate eyebrows," she said. "He'll have to earn the rest." He laughed and she smiled, and Thomas Wallace Bailey continued to express his early opinions about the world, and outside the February wind moved over the grass as it had moved over that grass for 1,000 years and more, carrying no particular message except that the world continued. The years that followed had the quality of a good and working life, not easy, but full and honest and making steadily in the direction of something real. The Panhandle was changing around them. The railroads were coming through, and the vast open ranges were being divided and fenced and settled with an acceleration that had its own kind of violence, the economic and territorial kind that didn't bleed but still destroyed. Wallace and Marcella watched these changes with the wariness of people who have worked hard for what they have and understand how quickly it can be taken. They grew the cattle operation carefully over the years following Thomas's birth, 12 head, then 20, then 30, always watching the grass and the water and the market, never overextending. They hired a young hand named Robert Fuentes, a Mexican-American man whose family had been in the territory since before the American presence, who knew the land and the water and the cattle with the knowledge of generations. Robert was 23, steady and skilled, and he and Pete Delacroix managed the combined Bailey and Hadley operations with a quiet competence that freed Wallace and Marcella to manage the broader strategy. Marcella continued to teach. She had, in the autumn of 1879, written to the county school board about the absence of any school for the children of the North Basin area, and had received a response that managed to be simultaneously enthusiastic and entirely without practical commitment. She wrote again. She wrote a third time. When Thomas was 2, she organized a meeting at the Greer store and convened the parents of 11 children who had no school closer than 12 miles away. And the result of that meeting was a subscription for a schoolhouse that was built in the fall of 1882. A single room on a piece of land donated by 3 families including the Baileys, and Marcella Hadley Bailey was its first teacher. She taught 3 days a week through the autumn and spring, when the farm work permitted it, and twice a week in the depths of winter. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and the history of the land they were living on, which she taught with the same unflinching honesty she applied to everything else, including the parts of that history that were not comfortable to acknowledge. She wrote to the school board twice a year requesting books and materials, and received approximately 30% of what she requested, which she supplemented with her own purchases, and with donations she solicited from the Amarillo newspapers, writing letters so precisely and persuasively argued that they were published twice as editorial correspondence. Wallace read those letters with a pride that he was not particularly modest about. He told anyone who would listen that his wife had a gift for making people see what they preferred not to see, and he considered this one of her finest qualities. In the spring of 1883, their second child arrived, a daughter named Clara June Bailey, named for the midwife who had brought Thomas into the world and for the month of her birth, which was full of the prairie in bloom and the particular sweet smell of new grass. Clara was from the beginning a different creature than Thomas, who was already at 3 a focused, serious child given to long examinations of small things. Clara was loud and immediate and full of a bright physical energy that she expressed by launching herself at the nearest available surface and seeing what happened. She was, in Marcella's dry assessment, exactly the kind of person they deserved. Thomas, for his part, took his sister's arrival with an initial period of adjustment and then, having assessed the situation, adopted her with the grave protectiveness of an oldest child. By the time Clara was walking, Thomas was her self-appointed escort across the yard, a duty he took entirely seriously and she acknowledged not at all. In the summer of 1883, Denton Carr died. It was not dramatic, a heart ailment, the county physician said, the kind that takes men who have pushed too hard for too long. Wallace heard the news from Emmett Greer and felt mostly nothing, the absence of feeling you have toward someone who was an obstacle once and then ceased to be. He told Marcella that evening, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, I hope he treated his own people fairly in the end," which Wallace thought was a more charitable epitaph than the man had strictly earned. The Lazy D was sold off in parcels over the following year, and the North Basin got smaller independent operators coming in on some of those parcels, which changed the character of the area in ways that were mostly good and occasionally complicated. New families meant new neighbors, and new neighbors meant new relationships, and the social world of Caldwell Creek expanded through the mid-1880s in ways that Marcella navigated with the same direct honesty she brought to everything else, making friends of people who deserved friendship and maintaining civil distance from those who didn't, without drama. Pete Delacroix, in the autumn of 1884, fell in love with a woman named Agnes Thiroux, who had come west from Louisiana to visit her brother, and found the Panhandle unexpectedly agreeable. Agnes was 30, a small, energetic woman who had strong opinions about cooking and stronger opinions about most everything else, and Pete was, to everyone's complete delight, entirely undone by her in a way he was incapable of concealing and wisely did not try to. They married in October in a ceremony held at the schoolhouse, and Marcella Bailey, who had become Agnes's first friend in the territory, and the person Agnes most often turned to for the kind of honest advice that people don't always want but always need, stood witness with a warmth that was the more meaningful for being entirely genuine. Wallace gave a toast at Pete and Agnes's wedding that lasted 4 minutes and contained more genuine feeling per word than most toasts contain in 4 times the length. And Pete looked at him afterward with the expression of a man who is deeply embarrassed and deeply moved, and is not sure which feeling to address first. Robert Fuentes married a year later, a woman named Elena from a family 3 counties south, and brought her to the Bailey Hadley operation with a quiet pride in what he had built here, and she proved to be as skilled a horsewoman as Marcella and considerably more patient with the cattle in difficult weather, which is a specific skill of great value. The Bailey homestead, which everyone had begun calling the Hadley-Bailey place, or sometimes just the Bailey place, but never without acknowledgement of its dual nature, which Marcella had never permitted and Wallace had never sought to change, grew into something that looked like what it was. A life built by 2 people who were each entirely themselves, and had found a way to be entirely themselves together, which is the rarest and most valuable form of partnership. Thomas turned 7 in February of 1887, and Clara was 4, and they were in the yard on an early spring morning when Marcella looked out the kitchen window at the 2 of them, Thomas examining something small and important in the grass, Clara attempting to follow the gray mare Pepper along the fence line with the determination of someone who has not yet encountered a fence she respects. And she felt a quality of fullness that she still, after years of this life, sometimes caught her off guard. She had not expected, in the months after her father's death when she had come back to this land alone and cold and determined, that this was where she would arrive. She had not been thinking about arriving anywhere. She had been thinking only about survival and about the land and about keeping what was hers. What was hers had turned out to include things she had not planned for. She poured a second cup of coffee and carried it out to the porch, where Wallace was sitting in the morning light reading the Amarillo newspaper that came 3 days late by post, as it always did. She sat in the chair beside him and handed him the coffee, and he took it without looking up, and she sat in the particular comfortable silence of their mornings, which she had come to love the way she loved everything else about this life, not sentimentally but deeply, in the way that things that have been earned through labor and time get inside you and become structural. "Listen to this," he said, lowering the paper. "Railroad Company has submitted a land claim for the northern right-of-way through the basin." She looked at him. "How far north?" 2 miles south of us if this map is accurate." He turned the paper so she could see. "It goes through the old car land, what's left of it." "It's not going through ours," she said. "No," he agreed. He looked at the map. "This will change things for the basin. More traffic, more people." "It will be good for the school," she said. More people meant more children, and more children meant more argument for resources from the county board, which she had never stopped making. She had a letter to the board half composed on the kitchen table right now, requesting a second teacher and an expansion of the building. "It will be good for the cattle market," he said. "If the rail comes to Caldwell Creek, we don't lose half the value in the drive to Amarillo." She looked at the paper, at the map of the basin that was their whole world and had been for years now, and she thought about the girl who had come back here in the cold of 1878 with nothing but stubbornness and a good horse and a refusal to give up. That girl had been herself, she supposed, but she was not exactly that girl anymore. She was more than that girl now, built up like the land after good rain, the same in essence but fuller, richer, more capable of sustaining life. "Wallace," she said. "Yes. Do you remember that fence?" He looked at her with that warm, steady gaze that she had been receiving for 9 years and still had not gotten entirely used to in the best possible sense. "Which fence?" he said, though she was certain he knew. "The one I rode through," she said. "I remember it," he said. "I want you to know," she said. She paused, choosing words with the care she always brought to important things. "I want you to know that riding through that fence was the best piece of carelessness I have ever committed." He was quiet for a moment. "Carelessness," he repeated. "It was careless of me," she said. "I knew it was your fence line. I was in a hurry and I didn't want to find the gate, and I told myself it wasn't doing any harm." She looked at the yard where their children were playing in the spring light. "I didn't apologize. I should have apologized." "I never wanted you to," he said. "I know," she looked at him. "But I want you to know that I understand what you did, leaving that gap, leaving that door." "I was hoping you'd come back through," he admitted. "I did," she said. "You did," he said. They sat in the warm morning on the porch of the house that had been her father's and was now theirs, on the land she had fought for and kept, and the spring air was full of grass and horse, and the voices of their children, and the gray mare Pepper was at the fence watching Clara with the patient resignation of a horse who has been followed along fence lines many times and has made her peace with it. And Wallace Bailey reached across the space between their chairs and took his wife's hand, and she let him take it. And they sat together in the fullness of it, while the Panhandle morning continued around them. That afternoon, Clara managed to follow Pepper for the entire length of the south fence without the mare moving away, which was, by Clara's assessment and everyone else's, a significant achievement. She announced it at dinner with the comprehensive triumphalism of a 4-year-old for whom success is always total and appropriate to broadcast broadly. Thomas said, "She didn't run because she's old." Marcella said, "She's 9 years old, Thomas, and she can still run faster than any horse in this county." "She runs fast for Mama," Thomas said, with the infuriating accuracy of small children. "She runs fast for everyone," Marcella said, but she looked at Pepper through the window with a private warmth that said Thomas was probably right. In the autumn of 1887, Marcella received a letter from a woman in Amarillo named Harriet Dennison, who was organizing a suffrage petition for presentation to the Texas state legislature. Harriet had been given Marcella's name by 3 separate people as someone worth contacting, which was an accurate assessment, and the letter was well argued and direct, and Marcella read it twice at the kitchen table, and then read it a 3rd time before she looked up at Wallace across the table. "A woman in Amarillo wants signatures for a suffrage petition," she said. "That sounds about right," he said, meaning, "Of course someone found you. She wants me to circulate it through the North Basin." She looked at the letter. "I intend to." "Of course you do," he said. "Do you need help with the printing costs?" She looked at him. He was reading the Amarillo paper and had not looked up. "You would fund a suffrage petition," she said. "I would fund anything reasonable that you put your name to," he said. "And women voting is entirely reasonable." Marcella folded the letter carefully. "You are a remarkably sensible man," she said. "I have," he said, "an excellent example to follow." She circulated that petition through the winter and spring, gathering signatures at the schoolhouse and the general store and the church, and from every neighbor within riding distance. And she wrote her own letter to accompany it when the final count went to Amarillo, a letter that was characteristically clear and entirely unapologetic, which was, everyone who read it agreed, the only appropriate register for Marcella Hadley Bailey. The summer Thomas turned 9, he asked his father to teach him to fix fence. It was not a request that surprised anyone. Thomas had been following his father around ranch work since he could walk, absorbing everything with the serious attention he gave all things. They spent a Saturday morning on the east fence line, the one where the gate had been installed, working a section that had come loose in the spring. Wallace watched his son work the wire with careful hands, his dark eyebrows, which had turned out to be quite good eyebrows after all, despite his mother's early review, furrowed in concentration. Thomas was a child who said little and observed everything, which Wallace recognized with the deep recognition of a man looking at a version of himself, and which Marcella watched with an affectionate exasperation because she had thought she was getting, if she was honest, someone a little more like herself. "Papa," Thomas said, while they were working the wire. "Yes." "Why is there a gate here and nowhere else in the east fence?" Wallace looked at the gate. He had been expecting this question for several years. "Because this is where your mother used to cross," he said. Thomas looked at the gate with the focused consideration of a child building a theory. "Because the Hadley land is on the other side." "It is." "Which is also our land." "It is." "So why do you need a gate for your own land?" "Because before it was our land," Wallace said carefully. "It was only your mother's land, and this is where she crossed the first time." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Did she ask to cross?" "She did not," Wallace said. "Did she apologize?" "She did not." Thomas considered this with extraordinary seriousness. "Did you mind?" Wallace looked at the gate, and beyond it at the east pasture in the summer light, and farther north toward the ridge where he had first seen her come, the gray mare and the streaming dark hair and the eyes that looked at everything straight on. "I did not mind," he said. "Not for a single moment." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to the wire. The years continued, and the Panhandle continued with them, changing in its way while the land itself continued in its own ancient way, indifferent to railroads and cattle prices and human ambition, but generous nonetheless to the people who understood it and respected it and worked it with patience. Clara began school in the fall of 1888 and proved to be exactly the kind of student her mother appreciated. Not the most obedient, not the most docile, but absolutely the most engaged and the most likely to argue with something she found unconvincing, which kept the classroom interesting. Marcella taught her daughter with the same complete commitment she brought to all her students, and managed to do so without any obvious favoritism, though she was not always successful at concealing her private delight in Clara's particular ferocity. Robert Fuentes and Alina had 2 children of their own by 1889, both boys, born a year apart, who spent as much time underfoot on the Bailey Hadley ranch as they spent at home, which suited everyone because the Bailey property had developed a gravitational pull for children that probably had something to do with Marcella's schoolteacher nature and Wallace's endless patience. Pete Delacroix and Agnes had a daughter, Isabel, born in 1886, who was Thomas's approximate age and his most faithful shadow, which caused Thomas a certain amount of public mortification and private contentment. Wallace and Marcella watched this development with the careful attention of people who have been through something similar and know how it tends to resolve, and said nothing to Thomas about it, which was kind, and exchanged many eloquent looks with Pete and Agnes, which was fun. In the spring of 1889, the railroad came through as predicted, 2 miles south of the Bailey Hadley property, and a depot opened in Caldwell Creek that transformed the town from a crossroads store and a church into something with more permanent ambitions. New families arrived over the following year, and the school enrollment doubled by 1890 and doubled again by 1891, and Marcella finally got her second teacher, a young woman fresh from Abilene named Miss Ruth Crane, 22 and idealistic, and very quickly educated in the practical realities of Panhandle schoolwork, mostly by Marcella herself, who was an exacting mentor and an entirely devoted one. By 1891, the Bailey Hadley operation was 60 head, which was the size Wallace had always thought would be sustainable and comfortable for the land they had. They had made no great fortune, but they had made something steady and real, land and cattle and buildings that represented 13 years of careful work, and the debt was paid, and the grass was healthy, and the water was reliable. And when Wallace looked across the south pasture at the cattle moving in the golden afternoon light, he felt the specific satisfaction of someone who has built a thing that will outlast them. He was 41 in 1891. Marcella was 38. Thomas was 11 and Clara was 8, and the 4 of them had settled into the particular rhythms of a family that has found its shape. The way the mornings worked and the evenings worked, and who made the coffee, and who made sure the wood was stacked, and how arguments resolved and how silences fell, and which silences meant what. On the night of their 13th wedding anniversary, in March of 1892, Wallace found Marcella on the porch in the night air, the March air still carrying winter in it, still sharp and cold looking at the stars. He brought her coat without comment and set it around her shoulders, and she pulled it closed without turning around. 13 years, she said. 13 years, he agreed. When I rode through that fence, she said, I was thinking about water rights. He made a sound of disbelief. I was, she said. I was thinking about whether the northeast spring was going to hold through the summer and whether I needed to dig a second tank, and I was riding fast because I had 6 things to do before noon, and I didn't want to find your gate. And I went through the fence and I saw you standing there and I thought, that man is going to be furious. I was not furious, he said. I know, she said. You looked like you'd been hit on the head. She paused. I thought about it all the way home. I kept thinking about your face. The way you just stood there. I couldn't think of anything worth saying, he said. I know, she said. It was the right choice. She tipped her head back to look at the stars. The Milky Way was out in its full abundance, which only happened on clear, moonless, far-from-everything nights, and they had all of those conditions in their favor right now. I want a 3rd child, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I know I'm 38, she said. Mrs. Webb will have things to say. The county will have things to say. I don't care what the county has to say, he said immediately. I know you don't. She turned to look at him. Her face in the starlight was familiar and perfect and entirely itself. Do you want one? He looked at her for a long moment. I want whatever you want, he said. And I want what you want specifically because it is what you want, not because it is convenient or expected. Do you want this? She held his gaze. I do. Then I am entirely in agreement, he said. She turned back to the stars. He put his arm around her shoulder and she leaned into him, which she did not always do and therefore always meant something specific when she did. And they stood together under the enormous Texas sky, and the wind moved through the grass, and the cattle were quiet in the south pasture. Their 3rd child, a boy, was born in December of 1892, delivered by Mrs. Webb, who was nearly 70 now, and had decided this would be one of her last deliveries, but could not in good conscience retire before seeing this particular woman through this particular birth. She came and she stayed, and she managed the whole thing with her usual impeccable competence, and emerged from the bedroom on a December evening with a smile that communicated good news before any words did. Wallace and Thomas, who at 12 considered himself old enough to be present at least in the adjacent room, stood up together when Mrs. Webb appeared. Clara, who was 9 and had opinions about being excluded from anything and had stationed herself directly behind Thomas, looked around her brother's shoulder. A healthy boy, Mrs. Webb said, and your wife is as formidable as ever. She always is, Wallace said. They named him James Robert Bailey James for no one in particular and Robert for Robert Fuentes, who had been part of their world for a decade now and deserved the acknowledgement. Robert Fuentes received the news with the particular dignity of a man who is very moved and expresses it very quietly, which was his way. James Robert Bailey grew into a child of great amiability and considerable noise, which made him entirely different from Thomas and complementary to Clara, who appreciated a counterpart of equivalent volume. The household in the mid-1890s had the particular quality of fullness that comes from children in various stages of growing, each of them entirely different, each of them entirely themselves, and the parents of those children discovering daily that love is not a fixed quantity that must be divided among recipients, but something that increases in proportion to what is required of it. By 1895, Thomas was 15 and had the focused capability of someone who would be fully competent to run the ranch within a few years, which was both remarkable and, privately, slightly bittersweet, the way children's competence always is. He had also, that year, begun engaging in conversations with Isabelle Delacroix that lasted considerably longer than conversations between neighbors' children strictly required, which Pete Delacroix tracked with amused attention and reported to Wallace at intervals. Clara at 12 was already taller than some of the adults in the Caldwell Creek School, had opinions about everything from cattle breeding to the rights of workers in the eastern cities she read about in the newspapers, and had announced the previous spring that she intended to go to college, a statement she delivered to the family at the dinner table as a fact rather than a request, which was so entirely her mother's approach to significant announcements that Marcella had to look at her plate for a moment to compose herself. "There's a normal school in Canyon City," Marcella said when she had composed herself, "and there are women's colleges. We will look into it." "I know about them," Clara said. "I've already written for the catalogs." Wallace and Marcella looked at each other across the table. James, who was 3 and mainly concerned with his dinner, continued to be concerned with his dinner. "She's yours," Wallace said. "She's yours too," Marcella said. "Those are your eyebrows on her face when she's decided something." "No," he said firmly. "When she's decided something, she has your face entirely." Clara looked between them with the expression of a 12-year-old who finds her parents amusing in ways she is not quite ready to fully acknowledge. "Both of your faces are irrelevant to my college plans," she said. "Entirely true," Marcella said. "Entirely," Wallace agreed, and was quiet for the rest of the meal because he was concentrating on not laughing. In 1897, Emmett Greer died at 81 of old age and contentment, which his wife Margaret said was the right order and the right cause. The general store passed to his son Daniel, who had been working it for 20 years and kept it essentially the same, which was the correct and only appropriate decision. The memorial service at the Caldwell Creek Church was attended by everyone in the county who had ever bought anything or known anything, which was everyone in the county, and Marcella spoke at the service in a way that Emmett would have recognized as precisely right, direct, warm, and without a single unnecessary word. "Emmett Greer knew everyone within 40 miles, she said, standing at the front of the church. And everyone within 40 miles was better for being known by him." Wallace watched her say it from the third pew, with Clara on one side of him and James on the other, Thomas and Marcella's seats empty because they were both near the front, and he thought about the morning 9 years before Emmett had told him about the woman up on the north end of the basin who wouldn't ask for help, and he felt a gratitude for the old man that was real and complete. The 20th century was coming. People were aware of it, talked about it, felt its approach as both ordinary and somehow enormous. In the Panhandle, the cattle operations were changing shape. Barbed wire was completing the work of closing the open range entirely, and the last of the long drives had wound down years ago. The world was different from what it had been in 1878, when 2 young and alone people had been beginning their lives on this particular piece of flat grass under this particular enormous sky. On a morning in the autumn of 1899, Wallace walked the east fence line as he still did, by habit and by preference. The fence was in good condition. It was always in good condition now, maintained by Thomas, who had the same meticulous quality about straight edges that Wallace had, and who had added considerable skill to it. The gate was there where it had always been, still the only gate on the east line, still marking the place where she had crossed on a gray mare in the April light of 1878. He stood at the gate and looked across the east pasture toward the ridge. The morning light was doing the particular golden thing it did in autumn in the Panhandle, long and warm and slightly melancholy, the way light is when it knows it's going away for a while. He heard hooves. He turned. Marcella came over the ridge on a horse, not the gray mare Pepper, who had died peacefully in the summer of 1893, at a comfortable age, with Clara sitting beside her and being remarkably stoic about it. This horse was a young bay gelding named Governor, whom Clara had trained from a colt and given to her mother with the same complete certainty that Clara brought to all her gifts. He was not as fast as Pepper had been, but he had an easy, flowing stride that Marcella had come to love. She was riding at a canter, not a gallop. She was 46 years old and had a different relationship with recklessness than she had had at 25, which was that she chose it more deliberately. Her dark hair, more silver than dark now and braided in its familiar way, caught the morning light. She sat the saddle the way she had always sat it, that complete fluid unity with the animal that had not changed in 21 years. She came down the ridge and came toward the gate, and she slowed as she approached, and she pulled up at the gate and looked at him with her dark eyes and her older, known face. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She looked at the gate, then at him. A look of complete and total recognition, two people who know each other as well as they know themselves, which is the particular vision that comes only with time and attention, and the choice, made repeatedly over years, to stay and look and understand. "I was going to ride through," she said, with a very small, very private smile that was still the most valuable thing in his world. "Old habit." "The gate is open," he said. She looked at it. It was, in fact, standing open, because he had come through it this morning and left it open, as he often did, because he liked the look of an open gate. She rode through. She pulled up beside him on the other side. They were both on the same side of the fence now, which had been true for 21 years in every way that mattered. "Thomas wants to take the spring calves to market himself this year," she said. "I know," I said. "Yes." "Good, he's ready." She looked across the pasture. "James has been following Robert around the south water tank again. Robert says he asks better questions than most men twice his age. James says he wants to be a rancher," she said. "What do you say to that?" She looked at the pasture, at the grass, at the October sky above it. "I say that this land has been good to us," she said. "And if he loves it as we love it, that's a fine thing for a person to do with their life." He looked at her, at the particular beauty of her face in the autumn light, the lines that the years had put there that were the record of everything they had lived. "It has been good to us," he agreed. "We built something," she said, simply and completely. "We did," he said. She reached down from the saddle and he reached up, and she took his hand, and they looked at the land together, their land, both of theirs, the fence and the gate and the ridge and the grass and the sky that went on forever, and the wind moved through it the way it always had, carrying nothing except the smell of autumn and the promise of another day. The fence line ran east, perfectly maintained, every post level and every wire taut, except for one section. One specific section, just south of where the gate had been installed, where the ground was slightly lower, and the old post from the original breakage had been replaced twice over the years, but where Wallace had always, quietly and deliberately, left the wire just a fraction looser than the rest. Not enough to be a problem, not enough for any practical purpose, but enough to be what it was. Which was a monument to a morning in April of 1878, when a woman on a gray horse had ridden through his fence line without stopping and without apologizing, and he had stood in the new grass looking at the broken post, and had understood in some way that preceded all understanding that he was never going to fix it, not really, not the thing that mattered about it, because what she had broken when she rode through that fence on that April morning was not wood and wire. It was the careful, sealed-off quiet he had kept around himself for years, the good enough life he had been living without knowing it could be better, the solitary sufficiency that had felt like contentment right up until the moment he saw her going away from him at full gallop and understood that he did not want her to go away. He never fixed the fence, he never had. He had just eventually put a gate in it, and she had come through.